Welcome back, everyone. This is week 2 of the Economics of Gender course with Professor Charu. And now we're going to apply some of the concepts that we have learned in week 1, particularly the concepts of visibility, invisibility, to numbers. And we're going to look at what is probably the single most important number in economics, the GDP, or the gross domestic product. The GDP, or gross domestic product, is defined in the following way. The GDP is the sum of all newly produced final goods and services within the borders of a country in 1 year. Every element of this definition is crucial. So let's start with the sum of all. As it turns out, when we say sum of all, we mean based on the market. So sum of all marketed, newly produced. So why newly produced? It has to be something I produced now to count for this year's GDP. I already counted, so supposing I buy a car that was produced in 2002, old model, I counted that car in 2002, so I'm not going to count it now. Final, by final I mean the finished product as it reaches the end user for that year. So for example, if we're going to count this dress, we're not going to count the thread that went into making this dress separately, because the cost of the dress already includes the cost of the inputs. So it's got to be the final product and not the intermediate products. Goods, by which I mean physical objects, cars, factories, food, but also services. So services are very often forgotten, but think of medicine, dentistry, nursing, nannies, maids, cooks, restaurant workers, all of them are in the service industry. So goods and services within the borders of a country. So if it is produced here, I will count it for this country. So even if it is a Chinese firm opening jobs in an American factory, if it is produced in America, it means it is creating the jobs in America. So I will count it within the borders of the country for 1 year. So this is the GDP, the sum of all newly produced final goods and services within the borders of a country in 1 year that flow through the market. Normally, if the GDP is large, we think that the country is doing well. If the GDP is small, we think the country is doing poorly. We often use the concept of GDP per capita, by which I mean the GDP divided by the population of the country. Because obviously, if I've got a large GDP, but I've got a large country, there isn't that much to go around. But if I've got a large GDP and I've got a small population, that means I'm pretty rich. So we also do other kinds of adjustments, which we don't need to do in this class, but if you're interested, please go ahead and make sure you take macroeconomics. We use GDP for things like figuring out recessions and so on. So the GDP is often used as an indicator of the economic health of a country, which means it's very important to realize or understand what the GDP does and does not tell us. What is visible in the GDP and what is invisible in the GDP. So let's look at that in the next video.